Hello, everyone. My name is Karamalegos, and I am here to talk to you today about responsive images for the web. This is going to be a great talk for those of you that are either new to performance or never had the time to necessarily learn about some of the details of serving images in a more performant way. So who am I? I am a developer in New Orleans and who clearly also likes creating her own costumes for Mardi Gras. And you can find more about me at sia.codes, or you can follow me on Twitter. I'm at the Green Greek. Now, you don't have to rush to copy down anything on these slides. They are deployed at bit.ly/web-images-2020, and all of these are links. So you can click on them and go to the places for all the resources I provide. So why do we even care about images? Well, images account for 50% of the bytes transferred as a median needed to load a web page, according to HTTP Archive. So let's take a little bit closer look at that number. What does that mean? For desktop, that's nearly a megabyte for desktop. And then for mobile, that's nearly 900 KB for mobile. So that's a lot of bytes coming down a wire for people on, sensitive data plans or just low bandwidth or on phones that can't necessarily process a lot. So that's the median. What if we take a look at numbers beyond the median? Well, if we go to the 75th percentile, we can see that we're pushing over 2 megabytes for images. And then if we go to the 90th percentile, we're pushing 5 megabytes. That's a lot of images to be pushing down the wire to people that may not want it or maybe on bad internet. So what are our goals when we talk about images? Because performance is always a balancing act, right? Well, one of our goals is that we don't want users to have to download unnecessary bytes. But on the flip side, we want our images to still look good. In addition to that, have you ever been reading an article on a news website, especially right now, and you're reading, you're like 3 or 4 paragraphs in, and then all of a sudden the whole thing shifts down and you have no idea where your spot is anymore. So we want to stop the layout shift. We just want to stop it. So let's get started and let's look to see what's in our toolbox for performant images. One, we're going to talk about file formats. Then we're going to talk about size and resolution, like what do we need to give our browsers. We're going to talk about art direction and the context of responsive images for the web. And then we're going to also talk about lazy loading. So let's dive right in. Let's talk about file formats. So choosing the right format can be way more important than any flashy new technique. I'm sure many of you already know the difference between raster and vector, but just as a review, raster are images that are coded pixel by pixel. So this pixel should be this color, the next pixel should be this color. So when we scale them, they look pixelated because they are only meant to be viewed at a certain size. Whereas vector images are a set of commands for drawing an image. They can scale infinitely, but it would take a lot to describe a really complex image. So that informs a little bit of our choices. SVG is the format that we use for vector images in the web, and it's written in XML, and it's basically a set of commands for drawing. So it's really great for simple, limited colors, sharp lines, basically your logos and icons. They're also a great alternative to icon fonts. So you can bypass some of the issues by having to load extra fonts by just using SVG icons instead. GIF. So just don't. This is actually a video. You can download GIFs as videos. And if you ever have tweeted a GIF, Twitter actually converts all of those to video. Why? So GIF is a lossy compression format, and it uses this averaging technique that just looks terrible. And then animated GIFs are essentially flipbooks of multiple GIF still images. And for one, that makes them huge. And for two, maybe even more importantly, is that they're not very accessible. You only have access to an alt tag with a GIF, but if you use video, you can actually provide captioning. So we don't want to use GIF because they're large, they look terrible, and there's better alternatives. Let's talk about pings. So pings or PNGs are great for photo-like images that need transparency. For example, this amazing cutout of my dog, which you can probably see on my video backdrop right now. I put him against a galaxy. So it's really great for this when you just want like a head popping out of a page, for example. It's a lossless format. So what that means is that it's kind of like zip files. When you zip a file, you don't lose any of the data. The data is just squished together more. It's not lossy, which is good in some ways, but in other ways it makes the file size bigger. So JPEG is our workhorse for images on the web. They're great for photo-like images that don't need any transparency. So here's my dog Harry again, but in a garden acting like he's growing a plant. Oh, and it looks like he's been up to some trouble in that garden. So if you can also use JPEGs for images that you show as circles. You can just add a border radius. So that's good to know that you don't need to employ a ping when in that case. Now, what else about JPEG? What makes them so great? They are a lossy format, but it was a joint photographers expert group who came up with this compression format. They wanted to mimic more what the human eye can and cannot see. And so what they chose was to compress by hue, which is something that we can't detect as easily. And so it's compressed in a way that we don't really notice. So we can serve smaller file sizes than an analogous ping, but it still looks good. What are progressive JPEGs? Well, a regular JPEG rasters from top to bottom, like the cat on the top row. And a progressive JPEG kind of does a pixelated blur up, which can be really interesting. Some people are a huge fan of these, but some people aren't. And one reason why you might want to consider whether this is the right choice for you is that it may be difficult for a user to determine when that image is finished loading. So they might just think it's a crap image, and then that may or may not reflect poorly on your brand. So just know the downsides of that. It's also important to note that there is no size penalty. Progressive JPEGs are about the same size as regular JPEGs. WebP is kind of the best of both pings and JPEGs. It supports both lossy and lossless compression, and it can also do transparency, and it comes in at smaller file sizes. So it's great for getting our file sizes even smaller, but also using all of the techniques that we can with pings and JPEGs. The downside is that it's not supported on Safari and on Internet Explorer. So that's not great, but there's a way that we can still use it by providing fallbacks. And we'll get into that a little bit later in this talk. So just to review on file formats, what's our little cheat sheet? Well, SVGs are great for logos and icons. GIF, just don't. You want to use a JPEG for a still or video for animation. Pings are great for photo-like images with transparency that have to have transparency. Otherwise, we want to convert those to JPEGs, which are photo-like but with no transparency. WebP is a great alternative to pings and JPEGs, but you need to provide fallbacks. All right, let's talk about size and resolution. So device pixel ratio, what does that mean? That means on a 2x screen, for example, a Retina screen, you need an image that is 200 pixels wide to look good in a spot that's only 100 pixels wide. So in your HTML and your CSS, you say this image should be 100 pixels wide, but the image that actually needs to be slotted in there needs to be 200 pixels wide. Otherwise, it might not look great. And so in this example below, I've taken a screenshot of this dog in a bantha costume from my Retina display. And on the right-hand side, I have a 2x image that's served in there, which is appropriate for that screen size. In the middle, I have a 1x. And on the left, I have a 0.5x. So basically, it's too small, and you can see clearly you can see clearly that it's not clear. It's blurry. It doesn't look good. So definitely serve at least the size image for the slot. And then it's a bit of an objective choice between the two on the right. If you can see through this broadcast, the image on the far right, the dog, I can see his eyes are sparkly, some of the lines are a little bit crisper. But if I hadn't seen that one on the right, then I might have been satisfied just as well with the one in the middle. So sometimes we don't necessarily need to provide 2x. It just kind of depends on the use case or how important the image is on that page, like visually. So how do we actually provide different images for different resolution screens? Well, now we have an attribute in HTML that we can use for the image tag called source set. And what a source set does is it tells the browser, it gives it a set of files and it tells them their widths. And then the browser can make the decision itself. We are not involved in that decision. We just provide candidates to the browser so it knows which one is the best to serve. So in this case, I have this place kitten that /300/200, and that's the source. So that's the file location. And then the 300W means it's 300 pixels wide. And then I have a comma, and then on the second line, I do something very similar, but it's a wider image, and I say it's 600 pixels wide. You still need to provide a default source for browsers that don't understand the source set. And of course, we always need our alt attribute if it's important to the flow of the page. So what this does is it gives browsers a set of files, and then the browser knows the screen size of the user and also their device pixel ratio or the resolution of their screens. So the browser can choose the best image based on that information to show. The only thing that happens in this case is that it always assumes that the images are 100 view width, so 100% of the screen size. But that's not always the case, right? So in cases where we don't have images that are 100% of the screen size, we can use the attribute called sizes, and it looks a lot like a CSS media query. So in this example, I have some max widths. The last condition has no media attribute because it's the fallback if none of the other ones match. The order matters here, the first match is used. You still need your analogous CSS. All this does is help the browser understand more about the context of that image before it has to download and parse the CSS and then know. Because if we waited until then, it would take even longer to render our page. So if I take a look at a waterfall so we can better illustrate this point, I have my HTML on the first line, and I have my CSS that starts downloading immediately. And then I have a lot of images that start downloading. And if I wanted to force the browser to choose an image based on the different sizes from the CSS, these would not even begin downloading until after the CSS was downloaded and the CSS SOM was created. So we don't want to do that. We want to start downloading our images right away, but we have to give the browser a clue as to what's going on with the images. So here I have, again, my source set with different images, and I say how wide each of those images is naturally. And then the sizes tells the browser at the different screen sizes, how wide will that be viewed? Well, this is starting to look a bit complicated, right? So one of my favorite tools for responsive images is this resp image lint bookmarklet. It's essentially a little piece of JavaScript that sits inside of a bookmark. And when you run it, you get an analysis of your page, and it will tell you if all of your images are really served at the right size and what percentage they are off. And then also what it will do is if you just drop a source set in there, it will then tell you the sizes attribute you need to use, which is really awesome because sometimes that can get a little bit complicated. And also you might be surprised by what you thought you did in your CSS and what actually is happening. So this is a great little tool. There's a link down here to it. So how many different resolutions do we actually need? Science suggests that humans can see 720 pixels per inch when they are 1 foot from a screen. That's pretty close. The iPhone 11 is 326 pixels per inch, and the MacBook Pro is 227. So in most cases, you're safe providing just 1 or 2x. You might consider 4x in the cases of really high resolution projectors or displaying art or something that's really visually very important. But note that most screens won't be able to show it much better than 2x. Let's talk about art direction. So art direction means much more than what I'm about to talk about here. Art direction in the context of images for the web is really about drawing attention to the most important parts or targeting specific features of an image when it's viewed on different sizes or platforms. As we can see here in this kayak image, on the very large screen, we can see the kayaker and a lot of the lake around him and the wake that he is producing. But then when we get on smaller screen sizes, we want to zoom into the part of the image that is most relevant, which is oftentimes the human element. And so in there, you can see that we have actually cropped it much closer to the kayaker. And we can do this with the picture tag. And so in the picture tag, I can provide an image. You always want to provide your base image because if browsers don't understand picture or source, they'll still render the image with its source. And then I can provide different images with different media conditions. So I can provide this wide angle image and this narrow angle image. So if I want to look at that in practice, this is the exact code. You see I have this woman with her dog and there's a Grand Canyon in the background, and this is a smaller screen size. But if I go larger, it'll switch to seeing more of the Grand Canyon because I have more screen space to show more, even though the eye is still drawn to the woman and her dog. We just don't want her to get too tiny on small screens. So the picture tag lets us do that. And then when it comes to performance, it also lets us provide bleeding edge file formats like WebP. So this is really exciting. What we can do is, of course, provide our image and its source. We always want an image and its source as a fallback for browsers that don't understand. And then we can give a source with source sets that provide WebP file formats as long as we give it the type of image /WebP. And so browsers that understand WebP images will use that as a source. The first match will be used. So always remember that, the first compatible file type. So this is a great way to use bleeding edge file formats without breaking Safari and Internet Explorer. We can also do media queries for DPR on background images. You might want to use PostCSS or AutoPrefixer to get the right prefixes. All right, we've talked about a lot. We've got WebP, source sets, sizes. Oh my gosh, this is getting so complicated. It's a lot, right? So here I have my WebP as my first set, but I also have a source set with different images and sizes attribute, and this isn't even a very complicated sizes example. So it's starting to be a lot. So let's talk about how might we generate our images and markup a little bit more easily. Well, for one, when I do things manually, I always forget my command line commands for images. I like to use ImageMagick and CWebP, and there's an SVG one in there too. I'm just forgetting the name of it right now. But if you go to this link, you'll get this little reference. It's just a GitHub README that reminds me of how I convert images to different sizes and whatnot. So check that out. If it's helpful for you, feel free to fork it and make your own. But it also links to the different tools I use on the command line because I'm a developer. I am a terrible designer, so I don't have tools like Photoshop, but there are great command line tools. There are also paid services. If you don't want to do that manually yourself, Cloudinary is a great example. A lot of people use them. It looks like Netlify also has a service called Large Media, which I want to check out. And there's a lot of others that kind of do similar functions. And how they work essentially is that you have a base URL, and then you use the URL itself to tell it how to transform the image that you have saved in the service. So you would upload a high resolution image, and then you could do different query params to get the image that you want. And then it'll also automatically slot in, for example, WebP if that browser understands WebP. And then it will also cache the images that it creates for the different requests that it receives. Cloudinary has this image analysis tool as well. And I have a star next to that because we're going to talk about that. And what you do is you drop your web page URL in here, and it will process and give you an image analysis result. Now, this is a Perf Matters website, but don't get too hung up in the score. It tells you overall what it can, how Cloudinary could, for example, serve up smaller images. But let's take a look in detail, because it will tell you image by image how it could be improved, which you could also use to just improve it yourself. And some of these are great. Like, it's like, oh yeah, WebP. Of course, on Safari, that wouldn't be the case. They'd have to stick with JPEG. And these are background images, so it's a bit more complex to try to serve that yourself. But then you have a few cases that it chooses JPEG XR. So if we look at can I use, JPEG XR is not really supported on modern browsers. So essentially, take it with a grain of salt. It is a great tool, but don't get too hung up in the numbers. Just use it for what it is, and know that it can still give you a lot of performance, but don't take the actual numbers as gold. So what are some other tooling options? Some people choose to use a server or a serverless function to select the best image to serve once they receive a request. And there's some build tools too, like various Webpack loaders, but most of the ones that I've seen can't handle sizes. They could do a source set if you had a source set that didn't require sizes, so only basically 100 view width. A responsive loader, Gatsby image, Gatsby transformer, Sharp. I mentioned ImageMagick earlier. Sharp is also really great, especially for writing JavaScript scripts to modify images. Just remember, display none is not a performance strategy. Some browsers will still load those hidden images. Let's talk about layout shift. So remember earlier I was talking about I'm reading, and it comes in and it moves. This is really annoying, right? Like, you lose your place, especially right now, and I keep reading the news. I really shouldn't. But I get very frustrated. I'm like, I can't anymore. I need some of these people that work for these online news companies to watch this talk, because we can fix this. What we can do is, if we have height auto set in our CSS and you put a height and width on the image itself, that tells the browser an aspect ratio. It doesn't matter if you're serving that at a different width. What this does is it tells the browser the right aspect ratio, and it blocks out that size on the screen so that you don't get that jank. And Jen Simmons did an excellent video to kind of talk about this, and also the alternative if you use it with width instead. So it's a great tool. Unfortunately, if you are using, for example, the picture tag to do art direction and you have different aspect ratio images, it's not really going to work on those. So hopefully browsers will come up with a solution for that soon. So let's see our after. In the after case, we can see that it loads without moving my text around. Yay! All right. Let's talk about some loading strategies. Well, we have access to a loading attribute called lazy now, and it uses the intersection observer, so it won't load an image if a user isn't even scrolling near it. So, which is really great for performance, right? Like, oh my God, unicorns and cats and rainbows and pizza and champagne, all my favorite things. But sadly, it is only available in Edge, Chrome, Opera, and some Android browsers. It's not available in Safari, Firefox, and of course not Internet Explorer. So that's very sad. In the meantime, you can use a tool like Lazy Sizes. There's also a way that you can lazy load embedded YouTube videos because they automatically kind of eagerly start loading in their iframe. So if you want to change that, take a look at that link. All right, so let's review our little toolbox. We want to use the right image type or format. We want to serve it at the right size for the user's screen width and device pixel ratio. We don't want to give them more and we don't want to give them less and it look terrible. We want to compress images. Some tools I like are Image Optim, Tiny PNG, or they're Webpack plugins too. I just, depends on how long you want your build process and what works best for your team size. You can also use newer improved formats like WebP, but serve them with fallbacks like JPEG and PNG. And then we can do lazy loading with a tool like Lazy Sizes. So there's some other resources down here at the bottom of the screen that you should definitely check out if you want to learn more. There's some great ones out there. And I want to thank you for coming to my talk. Once again, you can get the slides at bit.ly web-images 2020. And I did a Twitter series on performance if you want to check those out, which is different performance tips. And then finally, of course, you can learn more about me at sia.codes or follow me on Twitter. I'm at @thegreengreat. Thank you for your time.